Okay, I'm very pleased to welcome you to ROAPE.net. Can you just introduce yourself, your name, what it is you do, where you're based?
My name's Hibist Kassa. I'm a student at the University of Johannesburg, and yeah, I do research work. I'm an activist involved in politics in South Africa, but also paying attention to, and I do write on politics elsewhere on the continent. Paying attention to, particularly recently, Ethiopia. But I'm also involved or part of feminist networks globally, and then I also contribute to that through writing and engagement in policy questions, but also thinking around particularly political economy.
Brilliant. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about the workshop that you just attended. What drew you to the workshop? This was something the ROAPE was organising on structural transformation, radical political economy. You, of course, have a long background in Ghana. So could you maybe say a few words about the workshop, what you've taken away from it?
So, in terms of the workshop, I was interested in the workshop primarily because of the journal and the organization that was hosting the workshop in Accra, Third World Network Africa. Primarily because a lot of the thinking around political economy has been shaped or has been informed or related to the work of these both organizations and spaces. So it was important, particularly in the current moment that we find ourselves in, when we are still grappling with understanding the nature of the crisis in terms of how it's unfolding, the implications, because the triggers were something we're trying to explore, understand, and get a hold on in 2008, 2007, and so on. But the long-term effects and how it shapes process, I don't think we fully understand it, so we're still going through a process of reflection and thinking and trying to get various pieces of it together, particularly around reconfigurations of in modes of production, particularly in informal economy, trying to understand even it more historically, historicizing those processes and not to be caught up in too much presentism. So in that sense, I thought it was critical to be in this space because that's basically what I'm doing in terms of my own research work, trying to explore questions around artisanal and small-scale mining, but to do so in a very in a way that's more trying to understand the implications of what we're seeing as opposed to describing processes. So then engaging more in terms of what the concrete also means for more at the macro level and at the theoretical level, and the implications also for policy or thinking outside of policy and what that would mean. And in conditions of crisis, it forces you to think outside of the more mainstream approaches or even institutional approaches to resolving problems, because also there's a possibility of reconfiguration, and also because of a sense of crisis, a deep sense of urgency, in the sense that the political project that was the post-independence aspirations, hopes, and beliefs, and the attempt to consolidate these states in Africa have been falling deeper and deeper into a crisis. I mean, in the 90s we thought that it was a crisis and we were seeing states literally collapse, but then what we're seeing now and the extent to which we're realizing that this crisis of capitalism is going to be a long-term crisis, there's a possibility that we're going to see more of that. And how do we grapple with the situation? How do we understand it? And I don't think the workshop was necessarily going to cover everything and go into so much breadth and depth, and particularly when it comes to gender-based violence. And if you want to understand gender-based violence, it's rooted in dispossession in terms of the way it shapes gender, masculinity, sexuality, and these are integral to an understanding of the processes that are unfolding now. We cannot see these things as isolated or disconnected. So it's also forcing us, challenging the way we think about structure and its relationship to identity and politics. And even when we look at social movements and the way they're supposed to respond, or they're expecting a kind of the ways in which we engage with questions around these, we see that our movements, of course, fragmented now, and we're thinking of also the previous wave of the crisis, 70s and 80s, and the fact that we went through a period of defeat, and this is the circumstances we find ourselves now, and going through another crisis, which is multiple crises, existential crises. So in these conditions, we find ourselves also not in a position of strength, and the ways we might come out of this moment is very terrifying. The likelihood that, because now it's almost like we're to a certain extent thinking through defeat and how we come out of a process of defeat, and how, because at least my thinking is around that. It's not in many spaces I think there's much optimism, and I don't think we're wrong not to be optimistic, and maybe it's fine to grapple with the possibilities of going through a lot of difficulty and maybe some reconstitution that might take place, but then how to understand the present moment that we find ourselves in, and to come out of it in whatever way we come out of it, but to make sense of those processes as they're unfolding. And also the potential that might be opened up in some spaces. So I'm particularly worried about the case of Ethiopia. I'm particularly worried because I think it kind of brings together this possibility of collapse, possibility of not just collapse, but also reimagination and reconstitution. So it's not just one thread that is possible, but also a sense that the ruling class can no longer rule as they used to before. There's a real contestation, but in a space where the social movements don't necessarily, and organizations don't necessarily have like a grapple or have a space where they can converge around a particular political project, which is a crisis of, it's not isolated to Ethiopia. We look at the developments in Kenya, we look at what's happening also in South Africa, in the DRC. It's all very concerning in terms of the ways in which we don't seem to be in a position to actually shape things as they unfold, and we're just having things happen to us. So I'm not really sure in terms of how to make sense of this. So that's why I came into this space, in the hopes to be able to draw threads to make sense of these processes. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Hibist Kassa, thank you very much for speaking to ROAPE.net.